The chilling silence of May 10, 1990. What kind of monster kills an 11-year-old girl and her babysitter, then stays to take a shower? Cape Coral would wait 26 years to learn the answer. A quiet morning in Cape Coral turned into a scene of unimaginable horror. What started as an ordinary evening for Jan Cornell quickly spiraled into a nightmare that would haunt her forever. Questions lingered. What kind of evil could leave behind such chilling silence? Why did the murderer move family photos as if mocking the life they had just destroyed? These questions would linger, unanswered, as the day unfolded, a day forever etched in the memory of everyone in that quiet Florida town. On the evening of May 9, 1990, Jan left her 11-year-old daughter, Robin, in the care of her trusted friend and roommate, Lisa Story. Lisa, a kind-hearted 32-year-old woman, had recently moved in with Jan and Robin to share the rent and provide companionship. It was meant to be a peaceful night. Jan had gone to her boyfriend Donald's house to watch a game, leaving Robin in safe hands. But fate had something far darker in store. At around 3 a.m., Jan woke up on Donald's couch. She had fallen asleep while watching TV, and a rush of guilt swept over her for staying out so late. She hurried back to her townhouse, an unsettling feeling gnawing at her as she approached the door. When Jan reached her front door, she found it locked, both locks. This seemed odd, as Lisa only had a key to the top lock. She knocked, but no one answered. She heard faint footsteps from inside, but they quickly faded into silence. Was Lisa coming to let her in? Was Robin awake? Jan circled the house to the backsliding door and found it slightly open. The house felt wrong. A heavy, unexplainable dread settled over her as she stepped inside. The kitchen was dim, but Jan froze. Family photos that had always hung proudly on the living room wall were now neatly arranged on an ironing board. Robin's bright smile, frozen in time, stared back at her. Why had they been moved? What was the meaning of this? A message? A ritual? The unease deepened. Jan called out for Lisa and Robin, but no response came. The house was in disarray, items broken and scattered, as if there had been a struggle. She climbed the stairs to Robin's room, calling her name. What she found next would haunt her forever. Robin lay face down on the floor beside her bed, her body covered in bruises, her clothes partially torn. Her skin was cold to the touch. A scream tore through Jan's chest as she cradled her daughter's lifeless body, unable to accept the horror before her. But it was real, and it was only the beginning. The police arrived moments later, alerted by Jan's screams that had woken the neighbors. Upstairs, they made another grim discovery. Lisa's lifeless body was sprawled on a bed, also covered in bruises, mirroring Robin's injuries. Both women had been suffocated, but the horror didn't end there. The brutality was unfathomable. Who could have committed such a heinous act? What drove such cruelty? And why had they left behind such eerie signs, including stolen and misplaced items? The answers would remain a mystery for decades, as the investigation struggled to piece together the horrific events that had unfolded in that seemingly quiet home. The haunting clues left behind. The house was a scene of chaos as police sealed off the area. Forensic experts scoured every inch, and neighbors stood in stunned silence, whispering about the unimaginable horror that had unfolded. Questions flooded the air. Who could commit such a crime against a child and her caretaker? Was this random violence, or was it something much darker? For Jan, there were no answers to ease the torment gripping her heart. Inside the house, investigators began piecing together a grim puzzle. Cigarette butts were scattered across the floor, but neither Jan nor Lisa smoked. A set of car keys lay abandoned on a nightstand in Jan's bedroom. They belonged to a Toyota from the 1980s, yet no one in the household owned such a car. The bathroom revealed unsettling signs: a wet towel, droplets of water, and the unmistakable smell of soap. Whoever had committed these murders had taken a shower afterward, as if cleansing themselves of blood, turning the brutal act into just another routine. The most disturbing discovery came from Robin's room. Biological evidence was found on her bed, pillow, and body, revealing the horrifying truth that the perpetrator had assaulted her after she was already dead. On Lisa's body, a similar trace of evidence was found, along with a strand of male hair. Despite the bloodshed, there were no signs of forced entry, which only deepened the mystery. How had the killer gained access, and why had they left behind so many clues, taking such personal risks? Jan, barely holding herself together, shared her suspicions with the detectives. In the days leading up to the murders, she had been awakened by strange noises, the sound of creaking gates and the faint echo of someone trying the sliding door. On the morning of May 9th, she had seen a man standing outside her window. He had smiled before disappearing into the complex. She hadn't called the police then, thinking it was just a resident passing by, but now that smile haunted her. Could it have been him? Was that the same man who had planned such unspeakable violence? Neighbors added more layers to the mystery. One woman recalled seeing a car driving slowly through the complex the evening before the murders. A man wearing a red cap had been behind the wheel, watching the townhouses. But when police searched for the man in the car, they found nothing. With no immediate suspects, the detectives were left to follow every possible lead, no matter how small. The autopsies confirmed the unimaginable. Robin and Lisa had both been suffocated, likely with pillows after enduring savage beatings. Their faces were marked by unspeakable violence, bruises staining their skin like cruel signatures of rage. As the investigators worked tirelessly, each new piece of evidence raised more questions than answers. Why had the killer moved the family photos and placed them so deliberately? What did the stolen items, Lisa's credit cards, a checkbook, and a watch meant for her boyfriend, mean? These items weren't valuable, but they were deeply personal. The watch, engraved with a message of love, seemed more like a cruel trophy, suggesting that the killer sought not just to end lives, but to send a disturbing message. As police continued to sift through the evidence, forensic labs began analyzing the biological material found at the crime scene. DNA testing, still in its early stages in 1990, promised to uncover the identity of the person responsible for the brutal murders. However, the results would take time, and for now, the case depended on traditional police work. Detectives interviewed neighbors, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual that night. As the investigation deepened, a chilling realization began to form. This wasn't a random attack. The killer had likely been watching the house for days, even weeks. It was a planned, calculated act. Someone had entered that home knowing exactly what they intended to do, and whoever it was had disappeared into the night, leaving behind a trail of terror and unanswered questions. Would the DNA evidence finally lead to the killer, or had the murderer already slipped beyond the reach of justice? As the days turned into weeks, the town of Cape Coral, once a peaceful community, became gripped by fear. Every shadow seemed to hold a new threat, and the whispers grew louder. Who was responsible for this horrifying crime, and would they ever be brought to justice? A web of shadows and dead ends. As the investigation unfolded, the brutality of the crime weighed heavily on the detectives assigned to the case. Each lead they followed seemed to promise an answer, yet every time they pulled on a thread, it unraveled, leaving them more frustrated and unnerved. The killer had left behind an unsettling combination of recklessness and precision, making the investigation a confusing and haunting puzzle. With each step forward, the detectives were no closer to understanding the true extent of the evil that had taken place. Jan's recollection of the strange noises in the days leading up to the murders, and the man she had seen standing outside her window, pushed investigators to focus on the immediate area surrounding the townhouse. They began by questioning every neighbor in the complex, trying to figure out who might have had the opportunity, knowledge of the family's routines, and the audacity to commit such a crime so close to home. One lead in particular stood out, a man often seen lurking near windows late at night. Neighbors had always described him as odd, but harmless. However, in light of the murders, his behavior took on a much darker tone. When detectives tried to interview him, they learned that he had abruptly moved out of state shortly after the killings. His sudden departure raised suspicion. Was it a sign of guilt? The police tracked him to Missouri, where they questioned him extensively and even obtained a DNA sample for comparison. But when the lab results came back, they were devastated. It wasn't him. Meanwhile, the DNA evidence collected from Robin's body, her bed, and the pillowcases was pointing in one direction. All three samples belonged to the same man. A strand of male hair found on Lisa's body further confirmed that the same individual was responsible for both murders. But despite the solid evidence, the killer's profile didn't exist in the FBI's database. A nationwide search failed to produce any matching records. The investigators turned their attention to the stolen items, hoping they might hold a clue. Lisa's watch, meant for her boyfriend, was among the missing items. It wasn't valuable monetarily, but the engraved message made it deeply personal. Why would the killer take such a sentimental item, such a crime so close to home? One lead in particular stood out, a man often seen lurking near windows late at night. Neighbors had always described him as odd, but harmless. However, in light of the murders, his behavior took on a much darker tone. When detectives tried to interview him, they learned that he had abruptly moved out of state shortly after the killings. His sudden departure raised suspicion. Was it a sign of guilt? The police tracked him to Missouri, where they questioned him extensively and even obtained a DNA sample for comparison. But when the lab results came back, they were devastated. It wasn't him. Meanwhile, the DNA evidence collected from Robin's body, her bed, and the pillowcases was pointing in one direction. All three samples belonged to the same man. A strand of male hair found on Lisa's body further confirmed that the same individual was responsible for both murders. But despite the solid evidence, the killer's profile didn't exist in the FBI's database. A nationwide search failed to produce any matching records. The investigators turned their attention to the stolen items, hoping they might hold a clue. Lisa's watch, meant for her boyfriend, was among the missing items. It wasn't valuable monetarily, but the engraved message made it deeply personal. Why would the killer take such a sentimental item? Similarly, the stolen credit cards seemed like a strange choice for someone attempting to avoid detection. Detectives scoured pawn shops, monitored financial transactions, and kept an eye on anyone who might try to use the stolen goods. But the months stretched on with no progress, and the case grew colder. A year passed, and just when it seemed the investigation was hitting yet another dead end, a breakthrough emerged. A man from the same area confessed to killing 3 people and claimed responsibility for the murders of Robin and Lisa. He even warned that if he were released, he would kill again. The detectives were hopeful that they had finally found their man. But after testing his DNA, their hopes were shattered. The DNA did not match the samples collected from the crime scene. Once again, the investigation hit a wall, and the detectives were back to square one. Jan's anguish deepened with every dead end. She had tirelessly worked with the media, speaking to local news stations, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The media coverage brought hundreds of tips, but most of them were vague or unreliable. Cape Coral, once a peaceful town, now lived in the shadow of this horrific crime. Residents locked their doors at night and peered cautiously through their curtains, wondering if the killer was still walking among them. As the years passed, the case seemed to gather dust. The investigation was technically still open, but with each passing year, it became increasingly cold. By 2005, 15 years after the murders, the Cape Coral Police Department decided to make one last push. They allocated funding for a detective to work exclusively on the case for 6 months. The detective revisited old leads, re-examined the evidence, and considered any advancements in forensic science that could provide new insights. But despite all their efforts, the investigation reached another dead end. The killer remained a shadow, impossible to track down. For Jan, the waiting was unbearable. The loss of Robin, her only daughter, was compounded by the fact that no one could provide answers. How could someone commit such an unthinkable crime and then vanish without a trace? How could justice feel so far away? Years continued to pass, and the town of Cape Coral slowly began to heal. Investigators moved on to new cases, and life seemed to go on. But for Jan, every day was a reminder of the life stolen from her. What she didn't know was that the killer's time was running out. 26 years after the brutal murders of Robin and Lisa, a seemingly unrelated incident would reopen the door to the past and bring the long-sought truth into the light. The unexpected breakthrough. By August 2016, the murders of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story had become a chilling chapter in Cape Coral's history. The case, though investigated relentlessly, had grown cold, with no leads and no suspects. It seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. But fate had a different plan. In a nearby town, an unrelated incident would unexpectedly reignite the long-dormant case. Joseph Zieler, a 54-year-old man, was arrested for an assault on his adult son with an air rifle. Though the attack didn't cause serious harm, the law required Zieler to provide a DNA sample as part of the process. It seemed like a standard procedure, one that Zieler likely thought little about. But when his DNA was entered into the national database, it set off an alarm. The results matched perfectly with the DNA collected from Robin's body, her bed, and the pillowcase in 1990. The hair found on Lisa's body also matched his. After 26 years, the elusive killer finally had a name. For the investigators who had lived with the weight of this case for decades, the revelation was monumental. Zieler had never been a suspect and had not even appeared on their radar. At the time of the murders, he was 28 years old, living in a nearby town with a minor criminal record involving petty thefts. Nothing in his history suggested the brutality he had unleashed that night. When confronted with the overwhelming DNA evidence, Zieler denied any involvement. He insisted he was innocent, claiming no connection to the murders. But the science was indisputable. The biological material found at the scene and on the victims' bodies made it clear. Joseph Zieler was the killer they had been searching for. The news of his arrest sent shockwaves through Cape Coral. For years, the community had feared that the killer was living among them, a ghost hiding in plain sight. To learn that he had been so close, a shadow in their midst left many shaken to their core. For Jan Cornell, the emotions were a whirlwind. Relief, anger, and deep, raw grief all collided as she processed the fact that the man who had stolen her daughter's life and brutally murdered her friend was now in custody. The memories of that horrific night came rushing back, leaving her to relive the pain all over again. Investigators dug into Zieler's past, searching for any clues that might explain the unimaginable violence he had committed. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. In July 1990, just 2 months after the murders, Zieler had been arrested for selling stolen items and possessing an illegal firearm. He served a short sentence, but DNA testing wasn't required for minor offenses at the time. Had DNA testing been standard then, the case might have been solved much sooner. With Zieler in custody, the stage was set for a trial that would finally seek justice for Robin and Lisa. But as the courtroom doors opened, no one could have predicted the shocking spectacle that Joseph Zieler was about to unleash. The trial of Joseph Zieler. On May 8, 2023, nearly 33 years after the brutal murders of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story, Joseph Zieler walked into the courtroom. His presence was unnerving, arrogant, defiant, and utterly devoid of remorse. For Jan Cornell and Lisa's family, the sight of the man who had stolen their loved ones was almost too much to bear. But the trial that followed would prove to be even more harrowing than they could have ever anticipated. The prosecution's case was built on solid, indisputable evidence. The DNA collected from Robin's body, her bed, and the pillowcase, along with the hair found on Lisa's body, all pointed directly to Zieler. Forensic experts testified that the DNA samples were fresh and could not have been there for months, as Zieler had tried to claim. They described the horrors inflicted upon the victims, the brutal beatings, the suffocation, and the violent assaults that had left both women broken and lifeless. The prosecutor painted a damning picture of Zieler's actions. He had stalked the house, carefully choosing his moment to strike. He entered through a bedroom window, following a meticulous plan, and left behind a gruesome tableau. Family photos arranged with chilling precision, a stolen watch inscribed with a message of love, and discarded car keys. All of these items seemed part of a twisted psychological game, a reflection of Zieler's cruelty and sadistic need for control. But Zieler's defense took a bizarre turn. Instead of offering a reasonable explanation for his actions, Zieler lashed out in the courtroom. He hurled insults at the prosecutor, the jurors, and even his own defense team. At one point, he flipped off the judge, earning a stern warning. When confronted with the DNA evidence, Zieler made an audacious claim. He insisted that he had been intimate with Jan Cornell months before the murders, suggesting that the DNA found on the bedsheets was simply due to her failure to clean her home properly. The courtroom gasped in shock. Jan, seated just feet away from Zieler, was visibly shaken. Tears filled her eyes as she firmly denied ever meeting Zieler before his arrest, let alone having any form of relationship with him. The audacity of his statement, attempting to tarnish her reputation in a desperate bid to escape justice, left her reeling. Her heartbreak and outrage filled the room as she faced the man who had not only taken her daughter but now sought to destroy her dignity. The prosecution countered Zieler's outrageous claims with cold, hard facts. Forensic experts explained that the DNA evidence was fresh, consistent with the timeline of the murders. One of the samples had been found inside Robin's body, which completely contradicted Zieler's story. His defense was falling apart. Zieler's erratic behavior didn't end there. He screamed obscenities, interrupted witnesses, and openly mocked the court proceedings. His own attorneys begged him to compose himself, warning that his outbursts were only strengthening the prosecution's case. But Zieler seemed to revel in the chaos, as though determined to drag everyone into the darkness he had created. After weeks of testimony and evidence, the case went to the jury. It took them only 5 hours to return a verdict. On May 19, 2023, Joseph Zieler was found guilty of the first-degree murders of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story. For Jan and Lisa's families, the verdict brought bittersweet relief. Justice had been served, but the pain of their loss was still as raw as ever. The sentencing phase brought even more drama. Zieler's defense attorneys argued against the death penalty, claiming he had a troubled childhood and suffered from mental health issues. They also suggested that a motorcycle accident in 1998 had caused Zieler to lose parts of his memory. But mental health experts dismissed these claims, stating that Zieler was fully aware of his actions and had methodically planned the murders. Zieler's behavior during sentencing was as shocking as his courtroom antics. As he entered the courtroom, he elbowed his own attorney in the head, forcing security to restrain him. Despite this assault, his attorney chose not to press charges, continuing to represent Zieler in a final, futile attempt to save him from the death penalty. In late June 2023, the judge handed down the ultimate sentence. Joseph Zieler was condemned to death. For Jan and Lisa's families, it was the closest thing to closure they could hope for. As Zieler was led away, he offered no apology, no acknowledgement of the lives he had destroyed. His lack of remorse only served to deepen the wound. For Jan, the moment was bittersweet. The man who had haunted her nightmares for decades was finally held accountable, but the emptiness left by Robin's absence would never be filled. Jan thanked the police, the prosecution, and everyone who had fought tirelessly to bring the case to justice. For Lisa's family, the sentence brought some peace, knowing that the memory of their loved one would never be forgotten. But the darkness surrounding Joseph Zieler didn't end there. In February 2024, his 32-year-old son was arrested for possessing illegal materials involving minors. The arrest cast a chilling shadow over the family, raising uncomfortable questions about the cycle of violence and depravity that seemed to follow Zieler's lineage. As one dark chapter closed, another began, reminding everyone that evil sometimes runs deep through generations. Echoes of justice and unanswered questions. The conviction and sentencing of Joseph Zieler marked the end of a decades-long nightmare for the families of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story. For the community of Cape Coral, the resolution of the case brought relief, but it also left a lingering unease. How had such a monster lived undetected for so many years? How had he walked among them, free to harm others while the memories of that horrific night haunted an entire town? For Jan Cornell, the trial's conclusion was both a moment of closure and agony. Justice had been served, but it had come far too late to heal the gaping wound left by her daughter's death. Robin, a bright, compassionate girl with her entire life ahead of her, had been brutally and senselessly stolen. Jan's tireless pleas to the media over the years had kept the case alive, ensuring that Robin and Lisa's story would never be forgotten. But with the case finally closed, the silence that followed was deafening, leaving Jan to reflect on the years lost to grief and injustice. The case also highlighted the limitations of the justice system in 1990. Share your thoughts on this chilling case in the comments, like if it moved you, and subscribe for more gripping crime stories. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to stay updated.